these are normal people who went from throwing the 70s and 80s to throwing 90 miles an hour and beyond within a couple months or years. Now, even though 90 miles an hour might seem daunting, 90 miles an hour these days is not special at all. And 95 is the new 90 because the guys who aren't crazy talented or genetically gifted or have a 6'5" frame, they're still throwing 90 miles an hour and beyond because they're doing the right stuff. Now, if you're watching this and you throw under 90 miles an hour, I'm gonna outline the exact method and steps to throw 90 miles an hour and beyond. And I know this works because I've used it on myself to go from throwing 78 to 96 miles an hour. And we've used this exact same system to help a bunch of guys at the Pitch Lab throw 90 miles an hour and beyond. And before I get into the step-by-step process of how to actually get to 90 miles an hour and beyond, I want to start with this. I say normal people because these days, right, there are a bunch of people throwing 90 miles an hour. 90 miles an hour isn't even special these days. Like, you're gonna be throwing 95, even 95 plus these days to be considered an elite arm. The reason why I say normal people is because we wouldn't be seeing so many guys throwing 90 miles an hour if it required crazy talent or genetic advantages or a 6'5" frame. And so our belief at the Pitch Lab is that if you do the right stuff, then pretty much anyone can throw 90 miles an hour. Now, I know that's a hot take, but we say this from experience. I trained myself from throwing 78 to 96 miles an hour, and I consider myself a normal person, right? I'm not 6'5", right? I don't have crazy genetics. I wasn't super talented. I was 16, right? Throwing 78 miles an hour. I mean, if I was talented or genetically gifted, I'd be throwing, at least 85, probably closer to 90, right? You see guys who are throwing 100 these days at 16 years old. That's what you call crazy talented or genetically gifted, right? And even my co-founder, Albertus Barber, he was the same way, where he had to train himself to get to 90 miles an hour. And if you see him, he is smaller than me, and there's no genetically gifted attributes that he has, but he even threw harder than me, and at one point got up to 100 miles an hour. And so our belief is that 90 miles an hour is definitely possible for an athlete that does the right stuff for a consistent period of time. And I'm gonna go into detail on normal people that we've been able to train up to go from the 70s and 80s to throwing 90 miles an hour. So the method and the steps we take to get to 90 miles an hour is very simple. It's a two-part process, which is firstly building the engine, which is training up your body to be able to produce enough force to throw 90 miles an hour and beyond. And now that you have a body that's capable of throwing 90 miles an hour, then you have to move on the mound in a way that gets all of that energy and force to the back of the ball, right? If you lose it somewhere up the chain in your delivery and you're not able to get all that force to the back of the ball, then we're not going to throw as hard as we can. Now, I know this sounds really simple, but the fact is there's so much information online these days about, different philosophies, right? And there's contradicting information. There are different places preaching different stuff. One place might say, yes, weighted balls. Another place might say, no weighted balls, just medicine balls. Another place might say, oh, just do Olympic lifting. And it can get very confusing, right? And I feel you, because I was a 16-year-old throwing 78 miles an hour, and I wanted to find a way to get to 90 miles an hour and beyond, and I was just overwhelmed, right? I was like, there are too many programs out there. There are too many things that I could do that it's just too confusing, right? But as I actually went to all of these places, and I've been to so many facilities, all the big facilities that you've seen, I've been there. Okay, so I actually did their stuff, I trained there, and I learned there. And what I saw was a common pattern to where all of these different things come down to either building the engine or the mechanical part of things, optimizing mechanics. And I'll give you an example like weighted balls, right? For the most part, with plyo balls, they help you with your mechanics and move better. And so that falls under the mechanics portion of things. For example, medicine ball stuff. Yes, it's going to help your mechanics. It's also going to help your engine because it helps you produce more force. Okay? And so when I started to think about it like this, then it made everything a lot simpler. And I'm going to get into the details of what comes under each of these in a second. But this is what I want you to think about is firstly, build a beast of a body to be able to produce enough force to throw 90 miles an hour and beyond. And then optimize your mechanics and your movement patterns in a way that allows for all of that force to get to the back of the ball. Now, the first thing that comes under building the engine is strength. Now, why strength is so important is because of this formula. Power equals force multiplied by velocity. We need to be able to generate a lot of power to throw 90 miles an hour and beyond. Now, how strength comes into this equation, strength is the foundation, right, of how much force you can actually produce. A guy who can only deadlift 200 pounds isn't going to produce more force than the guy who can deadlift 500 pounds, right? And so we are increasing this force part of the equation. Now, velocity is something that I'll touch on in a little bit, but this is what I want you to think about and why it's so important is because I know we see some guys in the big leagues who are small, skinny, throw gas. One example is Yoshinobu Yamamoto, who was the World Series MVP. Everyone is looking at his training program and saying that, oh, strength isn't even important. But the fact is that he is a crazy genetically outlier athlete, right? He was, and people don't know this, was that he was one of the best shortstops in all of Japan growing up. Right? And Japan obviously is one of the best baseball countries in the world. Now he converted to being a pitcher and he threw hard right off the bat. And so he had some genetically gifted abilities to be able to throw extremely hard. But that doesn't mean that we should train like him, because if most of us train like him, we would throw extremely slow. That's why we only see one Yoshinobu Yamamoto. If that type of training worked, then we would see a bunch of Japanese pitchers who are small, skinny, coming out to the MLB throwing in the upper 90s, right? And so this is like a safe bet. We don't ever want to bet on ourselves to be that genetically gifted athlete because, to be honest, if you were, you'd probably know already. And if you're watching this, then you're just like me, a normal person, and the athletes that I'm going to show you in a second who aren't genetically gifted, and that's fine. Right? We just need to follow a step-by-step process to actually achieve our goals. Now, this is why strength is so important. And I want to tell you a story about how powerful strength accumulation is. And so there was one of our athletes, normal person number one, called Hunter. And he came to us throwing 82 miles an hour as a 17-year-old. Again, if he was genetically gifted, then he'd be throwing way harder, right? But he came to us throwing 82 miles an hour, and straight off the bat, we realized that he was skinny, didn't have the force production. This side of the equation was lacking, right? He was skinny, weak, wasn't producing much force. And so we put him on a strength accumulation phase. Now, as he started to gain strength, right, and he started to put on muscle and weight, that alone started to help him throw harder because we are increasing this, right? We are increasing this, which means that his power is going up as well. Let's just say he had a 2 out of 10 strength when he came to us, right? And so he had a 2. Multiplied by velocity, he actually moves really well. And so I would just give him like a 5, okay? Which means the power would equal 10, right? In this situation, because 2 times 5 is 10. But if we're able to increase him from here, right, to let's just say 4, right? And then everything else stays the same. Everything else stays the same. Then this actually doubles. The power goes up significantly. Okay, and so that's what I want you to think about with strength is that, yes, only getting strong isn't going to help. There's obviously more things that you need to consider, and I'll get to that in a second, but it is the foundation, and it helps because you're increasing power by increasing your force production potential, your ability to produce force. Right? Doesn't mean that all of that force is going to show up on the mound, right? That's why, powerlifters don't throw hard because they're not able to express it onto the mound and actually convert all of that force into the back of the ball. It certainly helps, right? A stronger, bigger athlete in general is always going to throw harder than a guy who is skinny and weak. Now, I think there's no better story than Hunter's where we actually increased his strength, right? Let's just say he was a 2 out of 10, but then we got him to 4 out of 10, right? But his pitching velocity didn't even increase, even though his force production potential, he was producing more force, right? He wasn't throwing any harder. And that was because this side of the equation started to break a little bit because it was producing more force, but his body wasn't able to handle that yet. And it wasn't used to that yet. And so it just goes to show, yes, like strength and gaining a lot of strength isn't going to help immediately, but it's the foundation, right? I want you to think about it like this. It's like with building the engine, strength is the foundation. It is all of this, right? It's the first thing that you should be working on and hammering, and then you can start working on all of these, complex things that you see online and the cherry on top type stuff. And so now the one thing I will say is that there is a thing called a strength base. Now this is a theory, but it basically says that once you get strong enough, you don't have to get that much stronger. And this is because the pitching delivery happens in milliseconds, right? And so there's going to be a limit to how much force you can produce in those milliseconds. And so if you keep getting stronger and stronger and stronger, there's a point of diminishing returns to where you're going to keep making progress, and then it kind of just plateaus, right? This is pitching velocity. As you gain strength, it's going to start to go up. For me, I was throwing 78 miles an hour, right? And I was a skinny, weak guy, right? And so all I did was strength work, progressively overload, and my ball velocity started to climb. But then at a certain point, when I got to about 88 miles an hour, I still got stronger, right? But my ball velocity kind of plateaued. And it didn't help me as much because I had already hit the strength base, certain benchmarks to where, I was strong enough to be a guy who throws in the mid-90s and beyond. Now, if you're a guy who needs to build a strength base, you're weak, skinny, just like Hunter, we actually made a full guide on exactly how we got him from 82 to 90 miles an hour. It'll go way more specific and in depth than what I'm able to cover today. And you can go watch that after this video. But once you built that strength base, or if you already have a good strength base, you can move on to the next one, which is power, right? Power work. And power, how I view it, is how much force you can produce within the limited windows that we get in the pitching delivery, right? I also call this rate of force development, where, rate of force development is basically how quickly you can produce force, which obviously helps, right? If you're able to produce a lot of force extremely quickly rather than slow, then you're going to be able to produce a lot more force, right? This is also included with impulse, right? Impulse is the measure of how much force you can produce within a short window, right? If you're able to produce more force within a short window, then you have better impulse. Now, I group this all under power to keep it really simple. And this is where a lot of the velocity gains come. And so normal person number 2 that I want to talk about today is Jake. And so Jake came to us throwing 84 miles an hour. He was a college guy, right? Again, a college guy throwing 84 miles an hour checks off all the lists of being not genetically gifted, not super talented, not a crazy frame, right? But he was in a unique situation where he had already had a really good strength base. He was strong. He was deadlifting 5 plates, squatting 4 plates, right? And benching like 2 plates plus. So he was already really strong. He had a body and a good foundation, right? Again, going back to that visualization to where, okay, we're gonna build this out. Now the strength, right? Once we've built this out, now we can start to move up. And this is the power side of things. Now we wanna shift our focus to how much force can we produce, right? And how much can we tap into in the pitching delivery. Now, if we think about strength, which is our potential to produce force, right? And I say potential because, for example, if you do a 1 rep max squat, right? It might take you like, 3 to 5 seconds to get it up. But obviously you don't have 3 to 5 seconds in the pitching delivery, but you can produce enough force to be able to get that squat up, right? And so it's potential, but not many people can tap into a lot of that potential because they don't have good, rate of force development or impulse. And so this is how I like to visualize it is this is your potential or your strength, right? And this is how much you can tap into it. and elite athletes can tap into about 80% of their potential, but most are tapping into way, way less than that. And that's what we found with Jake, who had a really good strength base. He had a good foundation, right? But he was only tapping into maybe only this much. Okay, and so he wasn't really tapping into much of the force production potential because he wasn't able to produce it really quickly in the milliseconds of the pitching delivery. And so that's what we worked on, was to get his body and its force production potential, right? And actually be able to produce force in small windows. And that produced significant results. And for Jake, it was all about the power side of things and also the optimizing mechanics side of things, which I'll touch on, which got him to 92 miles an hour within 6 months, right? That is a huge jump, going from 84 to 92 miles an hour. And we built a complete program for him on the power side so that, he was doing the right stuff. Now, the last part of building the engine also includes mobility. Now, mobility is something that you have to be really careful with, right? And I actually made a podcast with my co-founder that you can go check out after this video about how mobility can actually do more harm than good. And I'll give you an example of how this happened. So for me, right, with mobility, when I had surgery on my lower back, my whole body tightened up, right? I had lost so much range of motion that if I had straight legs, I couldn't even touch my knees. That's how tight I was. And so I thought that, okay, I need to open myself up because there's no way I'm gonna throw hard if I'm this locked up. And that was true for the most part, to where as I started to open everything up, I started to feel way better, right? And I was throwing harder. But I kept working on mobility. And what happened was I started to throw slower because I was getting looser, right? I was stretching out the muscles and the tendons, and I was actually losing explosiveness and power. So think about it like this. If you have a spring, I know that's a bad drawing, but if you're trying to get as much force out of that spring as possible, you would want a tight spring. And so when I was throwing hard, I had really tight springs to where everything was tight, but I was still able to get into pretty good ranges of motion. But because I was tight, I was able to rebound out of positions really well. And so what happened was I was getting into these deep positions, but I was getting less explosive, leading to a decrease in pitching velocity. But again, if you're someone who is extremely locked up, right, then mobility can actually really help. And one of the big cases of this is if you've gone through any type of surgery, right? For example, me, when I had a lower back surgery, I needed to open myself up. One of our guys who was in the low 80s and wanted to get to 90 plus miles an hour, he had just come off shoulder surgery, right? And so everything around here was getting very, very tight. And so we did have to do a bunch of corrective work to actually opening him up. And this really helped him throw hard. But this is something that I would treat with caution, because if you just stretch yourself out and you're not actually strong and explosive in those new ranges, then it can do a lot more harm than good in terms of ball velocity. The one thing I will say about mechanics is that it's very hard to give a general framework of, oh, these are the steps that you need to follow to throw hard, right? Because it's so individualized. And I'll give you a bunch of examples after this of the certain mechanical changes that led to a velocity increase that help guys get to 90 miles an hour and beyond. And each of these are going to be different. And that's why it's important to have, someone that can actually look at your mechanics and identify what is wrong and then tell you what to work on. And if you want me to do that for you, you can book a call below and I'll be happy to do that for you. But as far as this video goes, I'm going to do my best to give you a general framework, right? Because I know everyone likes general frameworks. And so what I think about with pitching mechanics is, firstly, you need to shift center of mass. Now, when I talk about center of mass is where all your weight is, right? Your middle, right? And so if I was here, then my center of mass is on my right leg. And if I was here, then my center of mass, all my weight is on my left leg, right? And so during leg lift, what we want to do is shift center of mass a little bit, right? Some people call it the drift, but I just like to think about it like a gather, right? And so I like to think about it as, when people think drift, I don't like it as much because they think, oh, as soon as I lift my leg, I need to be going, right? And that's not the right thing for most athletes. That actually causes a huge amount of issues down the line because I watch a video on how to drift and how this one guy just drifts like this and, through gas, right? But that I tried that and it did not work. An alternative approach is the drift can also come from getting to a balance point and then shifting your center of mass. That's all we need to do is shift center of mass during your leg lift, right? Ideally when it's a peak leg lift. I like a little bit more of a subtle drift to where I'm shifting my center of mass just a little bit subtly, right? I'm here, and then my center of mass is like, I feel it like in my left glute, right? That's kind of what I'm feeling right here. And so I wouldn't be able to hold this because my weight is right here, right? And so I can't hold that. It's my center of mass is in front of me, which is what we want. And we don't want to be in a balance point to go because we're not getting the most amount of linear momentum and momentum down the mount. Okay, and so that's the first thing, which is we want to shift our center of mass slightly, right? Not aggressively. I mean, if you're a guy who can do that, go ahead. Like Yamamoto does it extremely aggressively, where it's here and it's just straight going, right? That works for some people. But with the drift, more doesn't always equal better, right? It's not like if you can aggressively shift, you're going to throw harder. No. The pitch and delivery is all about sequencing and having all of these parts work together. And so if you're too aggressive and it messes the next part, which I'm about to talk about, then it's going to do more harm than good. So we need to find a happy medium for all of these, for it to all work together to get all that energy to the back of the ball. All right, so the second thing that I think about with mechanics is that we need to accelerate the center of mass. And we do this with the back leg, right? And so if we've shifted our center of mass and our center of mass is in front of us, right? Now all we have to do, and how I like to think about it, and when I've thrown at my hardest, how I've thought about it is it's kind of like a slight drop, right? We don't want to drop all the way, right? We don't want to drop all the way, but it is like a drop that we're feeling to where since our center of mass is in front of us, if we drop, we actually create a lot of linear momentum going toward the target. Why this is so important is because linear momentum helps pitching velocity immensely. You look at guys who do pull downs, right? And you can probably throw, like for me, I can throw about 8 to 10 miles an hour harder off a pull down because I'm creating so much linear momentum. I'm sprinting toward the target, turning and throwing. And because of all that momentum, I can throw way harder than off the mount. But we want to maximize how much linear momentum we get off the mount by accelerating our center of mass. Now, once we get that drop, obviously we don't want to go all the way because we don't want to get too deep into the back leg. It's going to make us get stuck. Now we need to find stability, right? Or an impulse and put force into the ground. And this is different to jumping. We don't want to be jumping off the back leg because that makes it really hard for us to rotate, right? And so what we want to find is a drop. It's like a stability thing. Imagine like you do a hop drill, right? And you hop into the throw. So you jump here and then you throw. That's the feeling that you want where the back leg is stable. It has control of the accelerated center of mass. And now it's ready to rotate into front foot plant. And that's the next phase, which is rotate. Now, what we want to accomplish with the rotate phase is for the pelvis, right, to rotate into the front foot and the upper body to stay back. Now, the big thing with rotating is we want to make sure that we're rotating down into front foot. See, because when we're on the mound, right, obviously we're on a slope just like this. And we want to match our pelvis rotation the same way. We want to go down into front foot plant. So we want to go down rather than rotating upwards because we lose a lot of energy that way, right? And so that's the biggest thing with the rotate phase, especially for the lower half, is to be able to rotate down into front foot. Now, the last phase for the lower body is the block phase with the front leg block, which is honestly probably the thing that requires the least amount of attention, because this is something that you can train yourself into. Like for example, when I was going from 78 to 96 miles an hour, I did a bunch of pull downs, right? And I also did a lot of work in the weight room to develop a front leg that's able to accept all of that forces that I was creating with the back leg and all that center of mass, right? And all that momentum. I was able to accept it and block it as soon as I landed, right? But for some guys, we've encountered a bunch of guys who have a couple issues, right? Some guys might not be able to block properly and they keep going forward, or they might, spin out just like this. And a lot of the times that can get cleaned up by the things that come before the front leg block, right? What are we doing here that might be messing up our front leg potentially? And so for the lower half, that's a general framework that I like. And the upper body is a lot simpler than this. You can obviously go into a lot of detail, but I like to think about it as the glove side and the arm side, right? The glove side, we want to use this as the front leg block of the upper half, right? The front leg blocks and propels our upper body forward, right? The glove side, similarly, I want it to block this upper body rotation and propel the arm forward, rather than it being something that creates or tries to create rotation, because that creates a very rotational delivery. I'd rather it be more here and then it throws the arm forward, okay? And for the arm action, all I think about is we need it to be in a good spot to be able to fire at front foot plant, okay? What this basically means is this arm has to be anywhere from here. It doesn't have to be a complete flip up right here, but it should be in this range right here. When I was throwing my hardest, I was actually like pretty deep like this, which is still fine if you're able to get it to release, right? But I would say anywhere in here, if it's here, then you're good to go. And obviously there's a lot more that we can talk about, and that's very, very individualized. And so for this general framework, that's what I think about, which is firstly, shift the center of mass. Next, accelerate the center of mass, rotate, block, the glove side and the arm action. Now, I know I just gave you a general framework, but what makes pitching mechanics difficult is that when athletes come to us and they're like, I want to throw 90 miles an hour and beyond, it's rarely one of those things that we're working on. It's more something that is extremely specific, right? For example, Kaysen, who was a guy who came to us throwing in the low 80s, right? And one of the big things that we needed to work on with him was that he was too linear to the plate. He was getting very pushy, right? And so we had to teach him to be more rotational, right? Because pitching is rotational. We wanted him to use more rotational energy rather than being pushy and linear. And that's not something you can get out of a general framework, right? And Kaysen came to us the low 80s, and just by that fix alone, and obviously we did some stuff on the build the engine side, he was able to get up to 90 miles an hour, right? And I think he's throwing a little bit harder now, but I'm not aware of it, so we'll just say 90 miles an hour. Now, another good example is Chris, who came to us throwing in the upper 80s, topping out at 88 miles an hour, right? But he wasn't able to make that breakthrough into 90 miles an hour and beyond. And he was a very, very unique case where just one simple mechanical fix got him to break through and PR by 4 miles an hour. And so he actually threw 92 miles an hour by fixing one mechanical thing, which was he was getting into spinal extension too early, right? He was dumping into this. And so one of the big things that we did with him was that we needed to keep him down, right? Relaxed, ribs down, right? So that the spinal extension happens much, much later, right? And we get that whip-like action rather than it being something that he dumps into spinal extension and tries to throw from there, right? Again, that's not something that I can really give in a general framework because we would be going on for, a long, long time. And the last example that I want to give is Andy, who again came to us throwing in the low 80s. We got a lot of guys who are throwing in the low 80s. trying to get to 90 miles an hour. I'm pretty sure that's our specialty. That's how specialty you get guys from like the upper 70s, mid to upper 70s and low 80s to 90 miles an hour. Like we have a really good success rate of doing that. But Andy was a position player, right? And he was throwing in the low 80s. And what we had to do with him was he was throwing like a position player, pretty much. So lift the leg and he had no linear momentum going down the mountain. He was just kind of like this and he would just rotate and throw, right? And so what we worked on with him was actually getting linear momentum and making his stride longer, right? That's not something that's advised most of the time. We don't want to just force the stride to get bigger, but in this case, it worked, right? And it just goes to show that, you know, pitching mechanics is so individualized. And so that's why it's so important to have someone to look at it, identify what you need, right? And then you can actually work on that specific thing that you need rather than follow a general framework. Even though I did my best to give you like a guide, right? An overall guide, the best results are going to come from the individualized specific things that you need to work on, right? For you to increase pitching velocity. And again, if you need help with that, I'd be happy to do that. First link in the description. And with Andy, right, this one fix helped him go to 91 miles an hour. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong impression that, oh, I'm just one mechanical fix away. These are outlier results. And I didn't even tell you the time frame of a lot of these. So Andy, you know, this took about 6 months, right? Kaysen, this took about 6 months, and Chris was very quick. It was only like 1 month. And obviously not everyone is gonna get results like these guys. But if you're doing the right stuff and follow the steps that I told you about in this video, then you'll be able to make a lot more strides than, you know, if you're just doing random stuff. And these are normal people, just like me, who are able to find a way to throw 90 miles an hour and beyond to advance their pitching careers. And so if you're in a similar situation, you can book a call below, first link in the description. And you can also go watch this video here where I break down exactly how he was able to go from the low 80s to 90 miles an hour and beyond.